You know, the left has been saying for some time now that they need to have their Joe Rogan. They need to find their Joe Rogan. Which is the weirdest thing because, Joe Rogan is not a conservative. He is moderate at best, liberal at worst, and, it's one of those things where they just pushed him out. But now they want to find their Joe Rogan, and they might have done it. They have Gavin Newsom, who, California Governor Gavin Newsom, right? He started his own podcast. It's called This is Gavin Newsom. And I'll say, to be honest, kudos to him for what he's done because, he was brave enough to have Charlie Kirk on his first episode, which I assume you all know who Charlie Kirk is. If not, super cool dude. He runs Turning Point USA. Very well-spoken guy. Great debater. Overall, super cool dude. And honestly, it's kind of surprising that anyone on the left would be brave enough to have someone like that on their podcast because normally when you see the left and the way they react whenever conservative influencers want to have them on the podcast or on their podcast, right? They tend to either give excuses in the case of some podcasts I've seen or just overall just say, nope, not going to do it. Which, that's to be expected when you can't defend your ideas, right? But Newsom decided to have Charlie Kirk on, which is good for him, right? And we'll talk a little bit more. Let's get into the news first, and then we'll talk a little more about this. So from Politico, Gavin Newsom breaks with Democrats on trans athletes in sports. California Governor Gavin Newsom, a pioneer for LGBTQ plus rights who decades ago upset leaders in his own party when he defied state law and issued marriage licenses to same-sex couples, suggested Democrats were in the wrong in allowing transgender athletes to participate in female college and youth sports. I think it's an issue of fairness. I completely agree with you on that. It's an issue of fairness. It's deeply unfair, Newsom said in his debut podcast episode of This is Gavin Newsom. I'm not wrestling with the fairness issue. I totally agree with you. Newsom's comments on the issue roiling political debates nationwide came in a conversation with influential MAGA world figure Charlie Kirk, the campus culture warrior who leads the organization Turning Point USA and is a close ally of President Donald Trump and his son Don Jr. Newsom also agreed that the most politically destructive attack ads from Trump's campaign featured Kamala Harris's support for providing taxpayer-funded gender transition-related medical care for detained immigrants and federal prisoners. She didn't even react to it, which was even more devastating, Newsom said, suggesting upward of 90% of Americans disagree with Harris's position. Then you had the video of Harris as a validator. Brutal, Newsom added. It was a great ad. Kirk challenged Newsom, a likely 2028 presidential hopeful, to speak out against A.B. Hernandez, a transgender high school track star from California whose triple jump event in the women's competition is drawing fierce backlash from the right. Newsom said he has 4 children of his own, including 2 daughters, and noted that both he and his wife participated in college-level sports, she in soccer and he in baseball. I revere sports, so the issue of fairness is completely legit, Newsom said, and I saw that. The last couple of years, boy, did I see how you guys were able to weaponize that issue at another level. Kirk challenged Newsom over his use of the word weaponize, and Newsom replaced it with highlight. Politico last month was the first to report about Newsom's new podcast, with the Democratic governor saying that he drew inspiration from the likes of HBO provocateur Bill Maher, who regularly finds common ground with conservative adversaries, while taking frequent aim at Democratic dogma, including on youth trans issues. Newsom's interview with Kirk was friendly, sometimes exceedingly so. He mentioned the influence Kirk and other MAGA world figures have had on his 13-year-old son, distanced himself from the use of pronouns in the gender-neutral term Latinx, which is the stupidest term on the planet, called police defunding lunacy, denounced cancel culture, and agreed that there had been some internal issues in the leadership of the Black Lives Matter organization. Indeed, the 75-minute interview presented Newsom in the opposite light than he appeared in over recent years when stumping as surrogate for former President Joe Biden and Harris, and sparring with ideological foes like Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and Fox News' Sean Hannity. Newsom in the podcast was also self-deprecating, joking that he only eats meals, including grabbing takeout, at the famed 3 Michelin star French Laundry, where he got considerable heat for attending a friend's party during the COVID lockdowns and conceding that he should have been celebrating at the Everyman Eatery Applebee's. Which, to be fair, listen, Applebee's kind of sucks. I'm going to be honest. I've heard their food's gotten better, but, whenever I was in college, it was one of those things where we went there because they had the half-price apps after 9. Beyond that, there was no reason to go to Applebee's because they were terrible. But regardless, on youth transports, Kirk drew out a longer response. There were relatively few transgender athletes competing at the collegiate level, but Newsom said it was easy to call out the unfairness, echoing concerns raised by Republicans in Washington and across the country who argue that banning trans women and girls from participating in school athletic competitions designated for female athletes would ensure fairness. While Newsom has at times touched on his own concerns about the issue, particularly around youth sports, he remarks on his eponymous new podcast and Wow. The remarks on his eponymous new podcast are his most expansive on the topic. He wanted to express sympathy for trans people, noting these poor people have higher rates of suicide and depression, and saying, the way that people talk down to vulnerable communities is an issue that I have a hard time with as well. Yet Newsom said Kirk was right when he contended that Republicans were capitalizing politically by painting Democrats as out of step with the strong majority of Americans on the issue. Earlier this week, Senate Democrats blocked a GOP-led effort to bar transgender girls from female youth sports. I agree with you, Newsom said. We're getting crushed on it. Crushed. Newsom noted his own leadership Newsom noted his own leadership on issues of LGBTQ plus rights, but he said even some of his friends have privately asked him why he's not been more vocal about trans athletes. He said the authority for trans K-12 athletes competing in girls and women's sports came from a 2014 state law signed by then-Governor Jerry Brown that also allowed students who identify as transgender to use school bathrooms consistent with their gender ideology. Newsom compared his position on trans athletes to conservatives who oppose same-sex marriage on principle, saying he values that Kirk and others are not abandoning their opposition now that gay marriages are both legally and socially acceptable by a majority of Americans. So on this whole thing, honestly, listen, Gavin Newsom might be turning over a new leaf. He might be a reasonable dude. I don't know. But in my mind, I find it very hard to believe that he's not grifting. Because, he's definitely going to run for president in 2028. He wanted to run in 24, but obviously Kamala had to run because, she was the DEI woman, right? She was the black woman in office, and God forbid a Democrat deny a black woman the opportunity to be president, right? Like, honestly, Gavin Newsom might have won if he would have ran in 2024 because, he's the pretty boy. He sounds halfway reasonable when he says stuff. And overall, I think he's more of a salesman, right? He's the guy who can make you think that the dumbest things on earth are reasonable, which is what the best salesmen will do, right? Now, I agree with what he's saying on trans people. I don't know that he agrees with it, is what I'm saying, right? It could all be a grift. It could be just something where he's trying to, make himself sound good, make himself sound reasonable. So when he runs for president in 2028, he can beat Vance, because I hope to God that J.D. Vance runs for president, because that dude would be probably the best president we've had in quite some time, right? But, I find it hard to believe it's not a grift. Regardless, so let's get into what he was talking about, right? So, transgender people in sports. Obviously, he's saying it's unfair. I agree entirely. It is unfair because, it's one of those things where you got to say not to be mean, even though it's not being mean. It's just being truthful. Women are less capable than men when it comes to feats of physical strength. That's just how it is. Women have less fast twitch muscle. They have less muscle mass. They have less bone density. They have wider hips. Overall, it just leads to not as much strength, not as much athleticism. It reminds you of that great joke in Futurama, right? Where they were on the island of the giant Amazonian women or whatever they were, and they were playing basketball, and they said, we no can dunk, but good fundamentals. It's the same thing I see, or I think of whenever I look at, any sort of women's sports. This is not saying that I'm super sporty. I was in high school, but I'm not now. But, it's one of those things where they're just not as capable as male athletes. That's why the women's soccer team in the U.S. was beaten by high schoolers. That's why Serena or Venus? One of the two was beaten by like the 100 or 200 ranked men's tennis player in the U.S. It's just how it is. And that's not to say that it's a bad thing. It's just how it works, right? Which is why women's sports exist in the first place. Because in men's sports, there's not a single sport that I'm aware of that prohibits women from playing. The only problem is they can't keep up. They just can't do it, which is fine because women should be allowed to be athletes. Women should be allowed to play sports. You just have to put them up with someone they can play with, right? And actually compete with properly, which is the same thing with weight classes in, wrestling, boxing, UFC, whatever. You don't want to have some heavyweight fighting a featherweight because that's just patently unfair, right? Because there's no technique required. There's no finesse required. There's no skill required. The heavyweight will win 10 times out of 10. If he knows basic fighting, just, how to throw a punch, how to take a punch, he's going to win. I mean, it's like, who was it? Tyson Fury, whenever he fought people, he would just lean on them, right? And that's the same thing we would see in women competing in men's sports. They can't compete, and it's not fair, right? So women should be allowed to compete with women so they can display athleticism, they can display skill, right? If you allow men to compete with women versus the other way around, right? Then you just literally just have only men's sports because women will all be beaten. Like we've seen with transgenders, right? They have been absolutely smashing women's records in, high school, college level stuff, right? Because it's just the way it is. And then he made a secondary point, which I find kind of disingenuous, which was to say that, if we don't allow them to play sports, they'll commit suicide, or, this, that, and the other about transgender people committing suicide. And my point on that is, listen, anyone killing themselves, anyone harming themselves, it's a sad time, right? We don't want that to happen. We don't, right? It's bad. It's sad. What we should do, though, is the same thing we do for schizophrenic people, because they also have a high rate of offing themselves, for lack of a better term, right? Suicide. We give them medication. We give them treatment. We find ways to help them deal with the fact that, they hear voices, and the voices tell them to do stuff. We don't say, oh yeah, those voices are real, you're right, everything's correct, and you should do what they say. We instead say, I know it's scary, I know it's hard, we're going to help you, and we give them medication and treatment. The same thing should be done for trans people, right? Because I always feel bad whenever I hear people demonizing trans people and saying, these people are evil, these people are wrong. No, they're sick. That's all it is. They're just sick people. They're mentally ill, and we need to help them. Now, the one part that I find very disingenuous about the left is that they say that, oh, this gender reassignment surgery is part of the treatment. And if it is, great. If that's truly part of the treatment, if we were to actually really do deep studies on this and find that that is truly how we can help these people, then fine, whatever. You're an adult, do what you want, right? But I'll say right now, when it comes to people who, have a mental illness where they want to cut off their leg or they want to cut off their hand, we don't cut off their leg or their hand, right? We say, no, you're mentally ill. We're going to help you. And overall, we generally can help those people. And they won't cut off their hands or their feet or whatever, right? So why should we not do the same for trans people? Because we don't want them killing themselves, obviously, because that's bad. Everyone deserves life, and everyone should be allowed to live. But also, we don't want them, chopping off body parts, right? Like, it's one of those things where we need to say, I know it sounds mean, I know it sounds bad, but you can't cut off your body parts. Instead, we're going to help you. We want to treat you. But you don't help people by saying, you're right, this is correct. Even though your worldview is completely insane, it is right, it is correct, and we are going to do what you want. That doesn't help anyone. It's called tough love. It's just like with surgery and things like that. Pain is part of the healing process. It's going to suck. Because think about surgeries, right? You break an arm, you break a leg, your appendix bursts, whatever, right? We have to cut you. We have to, use screws and whatnot in the case of a broken leg or whatever, assuming it's bad enough. We have to stitch you back up. It's going to hurt. It's going to hurt a lot, but it will keep you alive. It's the same thing with trans people. We have to say, I know it feels this way. I know it feels, like everything is wrong and you're in the wrong body, but we're going to treat you. And it's going to suck, but we will make it better, right? And I think we would see a lot of, in the vast majority of cases, we would see a lot of rescission in terms of trans people where they just say, you know what, I was wrong, and I'm happy I didn't do that. Because it's the same thing we see with people who are detransitioners, which, God, the left does not want you to know about, right? Where they say, I thought this was right, but then I realized it was wrong. And it's one of those things where once you have those surgeries, you can't go back. So we should do what we can to prevent them. Now, obviously, as an adult, you can do what you want. Does not matter. Do what you want. Some doctor somewhere will do it. But also, we should actually be helping these people. Because I really do hate that we just say, nah, you're trans. Just lop your dick off. Do whatever, right? And that's fine. It's like, no, that's stupid. Help them. Don't just say, yeah, this is right. This is good. That's dumb. Either way, got way off on a tangent about trans people. Back to the Gavin Newsom thing, like I said, I think he's grifting. I think he's just trying to get ready for a run for 2028, and he wants to sound reasonable because we've never heard him espouse any sort of these views before, right? And he might actually believe it now, but I don't think so because I think it's along the same lines of, Anna Kasparian or Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks, right? Where they're both like, I denounced the left. I'm on the right now, or at least I'm not left anymore, right? And it's like, is that true? Or are you just looking for the way to continue making money? Because that's the real question, right? It's the same thing with Gavin Newsom. Do you really believe this? Or are you just saying this so that people will think you're reasonable? Now, obviously, come to your own conclusions. Comment down below. Tell me what you think about all this. But that's my thoughts currently. And obviously, I'm open to changing them. If Gavin Newsom, puts his money where his mouth is, I would believe him. Until then, load of horse shit. Either way, guys, that's what I've got for today. Make sure to smash that like button, subscribe, comment down below, tell me what you think about all this, share this video with everyone you know. I'll see you guys in the next one.